Chapter 2, Part 4, Supporting Popular Relativism. The objectives for this video include evaluating a plausible argument in favor of relativism, discovering a number of potential challenges to this argument, and considering if the argument for relativism can respond to these challenges. The approach that we're going to take to evaluate relativism is to consider an argument in favor of relativism and then show that one of the premises in the argument can't be shown to be true. Given that one of the premises of the argument can't be shown to be true, this doesn't mean that relativism is false, it just shows that we don't have a compelling reason in support of relativism. To put this point another way, just because this argument for relativism fails, this doesn't mean that there isn't another good argument in favor of relativism. We just consider a very plausible argument and show that that plausible argument doesn't work as cleanly as we might think it might. And then in the next section, we're going to consider a variety of arguments against relativism. So this will work to try to show that relativism is false unless you have a way to respond to each of these objections. All right, let's look at the argument for relativism. It begins with the first premise: different societies exhibit differences in particular moral beliefs and practices. Now, I think that this seems plausible, and we're going to go in more depth very soon about each of the premises. The second premise: the moral standard that holds for society is determined by the moral beliefs and practices most widely accepted in that society. Okay, so that's just a statement of relativism. So if both of those are true, it seems that the conclusion follows. So different moral standards hold for different societies, or relativism is true. All right, let's investigate the first premise. Different societies exhibit differences in particular moral beliefs and practices. On the surface, this claim seems obviously true. This is why people often find relativism plausible, because it definitely seems like different societies exhibit differences in particular moral beliefs and practices. However, perhaps what appears to be differences in moral beliefs is in fact a difference in the descriptive claim that we accept about the belief. Accepting different descriptive claims of how the world is can lead to very different moral conclusions about what's right, even when we start with the same principles. Here's an example of the Callatians and the Greeks. So, the ancient Callatians had a practice of cannibalizing their dead, while the Greeks preferred cremation. On the surface, it appears that these ancient societies have very different moral beliefs about caring for the dead. But the Callatians believed that ingesting a dead person's flesh allowed the deceased a continuing life in the living person. So it turns out that cannibalism is a powerful expression of caring for the dead, according to the Callatians. The Greeks, on the other hand, held that only cremation could keep the body from suffering corruption. Given this belief, for the Greeks, cremation was a reasonable way to care for the dead. So notice that both cultures shared a strong moral belief about caring for the dead, but what was different was the descriptive claims that they accepted about the best way to do this. But wait. Sometimes there are actual differences over moral principles. Polygamists, for example, differ from monogamists over at least one of the moral principles that define marriage. So, although our example about the Callatians and the Greeks caused some problems for the first premise, given this point about polygamists and monogamists, it seems like we need to grant premise 1. However, what we do learn from the example about the Greeks and the Callatians is that we should probably proceed with the understanding that differences over moral principles may not necessarily be as widespread as they seem. All right, so here's our argument, and the first premise passes our inspection. So let's move on to the second premise. The second premise is that moral standards that hold for society is determined by the moral beliefs and practices most widely accepted in that society. So, here's a problem with the second premise. This is an argument that has a similar form to the argument that we're looking at. Different societies have accepted different views about the Earth's shape, right? That it's flat or round. The actual shape of the Earth for a given society is determined by the beliefs about the Earth that's most widely accepted in that society. So if you're paying close attention, you know what happens now. So the Earth has different shapes for different societies, or the Earth's shape is relative. Now, this argument is designed to be obviously absurd. The shape of the Earth does not follow from our beliefs about the shape of the Earth. So what this argument is showing is that we shouldn't think the same thing about our moral beliefs. So to compare the two arguments to hopefully make it clear, the first argument in favor of relativism: different societies exhibit differences in particular moral beliefs and practices. The moral standard that holds for a society is determined by the moral beliefs and practices most widely accepted by that society. So, different moral standards hold for different societies, or relativism is true. Now, the argument we were looking at that raises the problem for this argument: different societies have accepted different views about the Earth's shape, right? That it's flat or round. Okay, this seems to mimic premise 1 of the argument above. The actual shape of the Earth for a given society is determined by the beliefs about the Earth that's most widely accepted in that society. That looks a lot like our second premise, that the moral standards that hold for societies determined by the moral beliefs and practices most widely accepted in that society. So we ended up at the problematic conclusion that the Earth has different shape for different societies, or that the Earth's shape is relative. All right. So why does this matter? Well, unless we can provide a special reason for thinking that premise 2 holds in the case of morality, while not holding in the argument about the Earth being flat, because the two arguments share the same form, we have no reason to accept that relativism is true without also having to accept the obviously false argument about the Earth being flat when a majority of society thinks that it's flat. Here's another problem with relativism. If the widespread acceptance of a moral principle could make it true, then we would have to accept the conclusion that no society's majority could ever be mistaken about anything moral. Since the majority determines what's moral, the majority has moral infallibility. This is a very strange consequence. But societies can make mistakes about moral matters, and I think that generally speaking, people believe that societies make mistakes about moral matters all the time. An example of this is America's widespread acceptance of slavery less than 2 centuries ago. So generally speaking, this is taken to be morally problematic today. So, the first premise passed. However, given the analysis that we just concluded, the second premise does not hold up, so the conclusion also doesn't hold up. So where are we at? Well, this analysis only shows that we have no compelling reason in support of relativism. It doesn't prove it false. To prove it false, we need to consider arguments against relativism. And we're going to do this in the next section. To review, questions that you should be able to answer after watching this video. You should be able to provide a plausible argument in favor of relativism, and then identify a number of potential challenges to this argument. And you should be able to ask, how might the argument for relativism respond to these challenges?